Welcome to the RRX Health Watch, the right dose. Hello, my name is Bob Karzewski, and I am a co-host of this Reality RX podcast series. This series offers insights and opinions from industry experts on timely topics of interest to healthcare marketers. We gather these insights and opinions from interviews with clinicians, patients, marketers, and other thought leaders, delivering informative and provocative discussion on what's happening in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and healthcare industries.
Hi, my name is Steve Nothell, the other co-host for this series. This is our first episode in the series, Clinical Trials and COVID-19, an Insider's Perspective. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed how businesses do business in countless ways. Nowhere is that change more evident than in the world of clinical trials. Since early March, hundreds of acting sponsors, collaborators, and CROs have announced major disruptions to planned and ongoing clinical trials. The hospitals that serve as trial sites have been inundated with COVID-19 patients. Non-COVID-19 trials are being deprioritized, as are the trials with immunocompromised patients who are at greater risk of contracting the virus. Data does suggest that the number of disruptive trials has nearly doubled by early May, and approximately 70% of disruptions are due to suspended patient enrollment. However, this upward trend in clinical trial delays may be slowly changing as more companies adjust to the new normal and develop innovative methods to conduct clinical trials without jeopardizing patient safety. Today's guest is Nick Borys, MD, Chief Medical Officer at Celsion Corporation. Hi, Nick. How are you?
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you with us. Could you just provide a brief background of yourself, your company, and what you've been up to the last couple of years with regards to clinical trials, focusing on sort of the last 3 to 4 months?
Sure. I've been in clinical research now for about 25 years. I trained as an internist and then quickly morphed my career into research in radiology, particularly imaging technologies, and then slowly migrated over to oncology research, which I've been pretty well spending now for the last 15 to 20 years. For the last 13 years, I've been working at Celsion Corporation, and we've been investigating an interesting compound for liver cancer. And the results of that study is going to be coming out pretty soon. And so we're pretty excited about that. So this, with the COVID coming, this will make for an interesting discussion of how that impacted us. Also, we've developed a new technology in ovarian cancer, and we were starting some phase 2 trials in the last few months. And that also has impacted us and should make for an interesting discussion as we go forward.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick. So why don't we just jump right into it? As we all know, COVID-19 has impacted every aspect of our life, and most of us are adjusting as we go along. How has this pandemic affected your ongoing clinical trials, and what kind of adjustments have you had to make in these trials?
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is that I work with a lot of medical professionals, oncologists, research professionals around the world. And at first I thought that, wow, we're going to get hit with this COVID thing. Everybody's going to have to put their pencils down and everything's going to slow down. To my surprise, my colleagues just kept on pushing forward. And if anything, my life got much more busier since the COVID hit. People just tried to take up the slack where it needed to be taken up, and we communicated a lot more often in order to try to overcome the obstacles of what the COVID presented to us and presented to our patients. So if anything, things got a lot busier for us and a lot more problem solving had to take place.
Wow, that's really interesting. It would have initially thought things slowed down, but it sounds like there's a lot more going on than I think many of us may think.
Yeah, we thought that the lockdown was going to give us a little bit of vacation and give us a breather, but it did not.
That's interesting. Are there some changes that you've heard or seen from some of your colleagues with regards to the clinical trials themselves and conducting them, and what has significantly changed, if so?
Yeah, so the work that we do at Celsion is truly international. So we get probably the majority of our patients from Asia. particularly because of liver cancer. And liver cancer is a very big problem in Asia. It's one of the top cancers that there are there. And as you know, COVID started in Wuhan in China. One of our most important sites was about 80 miles from the epicenter. So that hospital closed down soon after the COVID struck. And we worked directly with the hospital and the investigators on how to manage the data the best. Luckily for us, we were at the tail end of our study. So at that point in the study, we were only collecting follow-up data. But still, the investigators there were able to use technology, telephones, cell phones, track their patients, and still get the data in terms of our progression of the disease, the overall survival of the patients to us with maybe just a few weeks of delay in the overall protocol timelines. So the whole idea was increasing the communication with the sites, using the technology you can, and thinking out of the box in terms of getting the data you need, and also thinking what data is most important. You know, in any other field, in science and technology, some data is critical and some data is nice to have. And so many decisions had to be made as which visits are most important and which visits are less important. So we were able to figure that out pretty soon. The other thing that came up is very soon after COVID hit, and we saw that there was going to be an impact on research. You'll note even the FDA, the EMA, they put out guidelines on how to deal with data interruptions during the COVID epidemic. And so, believe it or not, it came out maybe a few weeks into the COVID epidemic, and we already had guidelines from the regulatory authorities on what to do with our data and how to handle it and how to report it when everything's said and done.
Well, that's really, you guys must have been in the forefront of everything with regards to clinical trials, considering so much was going on in China.
Yeah, the whole secret to this thing is maintaining communication. And luckily for us as a small company, we're able to deal directly. For myself, I can make phone calls, emails, and texts directly to my colleagues in China and talk to them about the situation and try to come up with plans on how to deal with, you know, are patients having trouble getting to the sites? Are we having trouble following up with these patients? What technology can we use? And what kind of deviations can we expect in terms of collecting all the data?
So you mentioned that your trial in liver cancer is ending, but you also have a new phase 2 trial coming up that you're working on. In addition to the things you've already discussed, like getting change of how do you get the data, communication, are there anything else in the format or methodology that you see maybe changing for your phase 2 or even in the future?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Now, different types of challenges come into when you're starting a trial. First of all, you know, the number one thing that I worry about when I start a trial is getting the right sites on board and then making sure those sites get the patients. But the other half of the equation is getting the drug to the sites. So as you can recall, when this whole thing started, basically the country shut down here in the US. And it was very difficult to ship things, get things through the typical transportation processes, and getting our drugs out of the factories, the supply chain was a big question. And this again is where I think as a small company, you're very nimble and you work with your supply chain and with your manufacturers on try to work your way around it. For us, again, we had to delay things a few months in terms of getting our ovarian cancer trial started, but we did it to ensure that when the patient shows up the first day to get their drug, the drug indeed was there. Because our drug has special storage conditions, needs to be frozen, needs to be transported in a frozen state. So it takes a lot of logistics and making sure nothing falls between the cracks. So that was a different set of challenges that as we're speaking right now that we're still dealing with in starting up our study. But again, through communication with our investigators, because when we told them we're gonna have to delay things maybe a few months, they were all very disappointed, but they understand because getting the drug available for the patient is very important.
Yeah, that's great how you were able to do all that, Nick. And the story that you tell about having to do the research in China and the focus that you had in that particular area, given our situation, it's quite fascinating, and commends to you guys for really being able to keep this thing going and being able to get to the results that you need to get to in a relatively timely fashion, with considering all the obstacles that have been thrown your way. Now we're going to just change it up a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about recruiting patients. Most hospitals, doctor offices, clinics report fewer in-person visits, procedures, things like that weren't happening for a while. Did you see, or have you seen a similar trend with patient recruitment for your clinical trials as you were moving forward?
Yeah, Bob, that's an interesting question for us. As of right now, like I mentioned, we have one study that was finishing up, so we weren't recruiting anymore. But we're going to be going through a startup phase now in our ovarian cancer study. But I've been talking to my colleagues at the different institutions around the country about what they're seeing. And interestingly, ASCO this morning in their newsletter, they just reported that they saw around a 50% drop in cancer trial participation over the last 2 months. And you could imagine why people are hesitating, getting into signing up for clinical trials. And I would imagine that the other aspect of this is, because of the virus, people are maybe putting off their doctor visits. They're putting off going to a hospital if something's bothering them. And we are seeing that report. And I think you were mentioning that again in the introduction, that there's been a drop off in hospitalizations across the country. So a lot of that is because people are hesitating. So we are seeing that. But interestingly, for the patients that we had enrolled in the studies and the follow-up for them, particularly in our ovarian cancer study, we rarely saw a patient hesitate to come back for a follow-up visit. So they're taking their cancer very, very seriously, and they were working with the clinicians to work on the best way to deal with the COVID and still get in for their follow-up. And that's very important. And also the way you design the clinical trial is also very important, where we were very fortunate. We were having the patients come to the hospital at a time where they needed a clinical follow-up. Their questions could come up in other studies. Do you really need a follow-up visit for just to check to see if somebody's temperature is okay, or if their blood work is okay, if it's not clinically called for? So those are the kind of questions I think moving forward in the next phase of my clinical trials, I'm probably going to be asking a lot more of. Do we really need to take the patient out of their homes just to get some blood work when we don't suspect anything?
Yeah, very interesting, Nick. As you recruit patients, and I know even here looking at the procedures that are opening up in hospitalizations, if it's not emergency, but really those types of procedures that are more voluntary, or patients, some of them are hesitant to even come. So that really speaks to the whole safety issue. So, with patients, have you seen a shift in patient safety concerns as you start, or any of your colleagues? And what do you do to address that, or what are you doing to address safety concerns or patient safety concerns today as you start recruiting in that second trial that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we're still developing that because previously. Hospitals, you as a person visiting a hospital, you could pretty well go through any entrance to get to the department you wanted. Now with COVID, certain parts of hospitals are now blocked off for COVID use and then for non-COVID use. And then there's going to be certain parts of the hospitals that are going to have to be secure and made for research subjects. So you're going to see, so we are seeing that, and you are going to see more and more of that, where patients are going to have to be directed a certain way to go to hospitals. We're going to be doing a lot of more remote managing of the patients, where, as we were talking about in the last question, do patients really need to do a follow-up just for a simple physical or a routine blood work? Maybe we could incorporate more telemedicine more technology, or maybe bring the hospital to the patient with having remote nurses go out and visit the patients instead of the other way around. Because as you can imagine, a lot of these patients are immunocompromised, and you want to minimize the time that they're out of the home, especially during COVID. So these are all considerations. Whether we have a good plan in place right now is yet to be seen. But what we do, we're trying to err on the side of safety, where if we need to miss a visit, we'll miss a visit. And if we really need the patient to come in, we'll try to work with the patient to make it as safe for them as possible. Some of the ideas that we've had is that we don't have to have the patient go to a major research center in order to get their exams done. Maybe they could just go to their local clinic, and we work with the local doctor to get the information we need. So we're trying to think out of the box. We have to document everything as we move forward, and then work with the authorities to make sure that everything can be followed up and checked appropriately.
Yeah, that's very interesting. All doctors' offices have all changed their protocols, and hospitals, and how they get patients in and how they get patients out and taking temperatures. So I guess you'll have a number of those examples to kind of look at as far as when you're developing your procedures and your protocols to go forward.
Yeah, we have a lot to learn and a lot to figure out yet. And I think the field will be better as a result of it.
Great.
Nick, it's interesting how you talk about the changes and things that are evolving. One of the things that was even starting a little bit before COVID-19 was regards to the decentralization of the clinical trial landscape. Some of the things that you're talking about, telehealth, maybe not big hospitals. I would make the assumption that you would think that that's going to only grow over time once everybody figures out kind of how to do things the most safe and efficient way for both the patients, but also, the strength of the clinical trial.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're going to see some changes, and I'm a big fan of using technology wisely. I'm not a big fan of technology for the sake of technology, but I think that moving forward, for example, we at Celsion have started using remote monitoring. And it's still a little bit more of a budding field. You see a lot of it being talked about in the industry, but when you try it, it becomes a lot more complicated than on the surface. So we've been using it. It's been working rather well, but there still is a lot of challenges in terms of making sure you're getting the data that you want to get, because there's a lot of consideration in terms of patient privacy, what you're allowed access to in the hospital, and what the hospital allow access to you in terms of remote monitoring. So there's a lot of security issues that need to be overcome, but I think COVID is just a thing that will force the issue and make that technology more secure and better available to the research community. So there's a lot of players in this, and I think there's a lot to be learned, and it's going to be a bit of a process.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It pretty much heated up and sped things that were already starting to happen, and now they have to happen considering the type of situation that we're in worldwide. That's for sure. You talk about clinical data. Obviously, clinical data exceedingly important in any clinical trials that we're doing. How do you envision that change of clinical data reporting, happening as we move forward?
Yeah, the whole process of gathering the data, securing the data, checking the data, monitoring it through the process, and then bringing it back in for managing the data and then interpreting the data, to me, has become very bloated. Even in the short while that I've been in the industry, it's become very complicated, very complex, full of regulations, full of many, many layers, and highly expensive. So to small companies like mine, things have just skyrocketed in terms of how to manage it and then how to pay for it. So I think this is an opportunity for us to take another look on how we collect data and how we process it and how we check it. And we have to find, I think, more efficient ways of doing it. And I'm really hopeful that the silver lining in the COVID cloud is that it forces us to become more efficient, more focused, and maybe another byproduct would be less expensive. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens at the other side of this thing.
Well, thank you. You know what, talking about efficiency and gathering data, obviously telehealth and mobile apps, are starting to grow. They may help be more efficient for, clinical trials moving forward. In addition to things, as you had mentioned, maybe a nurse going in to check somebody's blood pressure or going to do the blood test. Are there other areas of telehealth or mobile health apps you can envision and those platforms increasing as time goes forward with clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, some of the obvious ones that come to mind is just like you said, using it for the simple vital signs, simple reporting of what's going on with the patient. Probably there's already out there, I haven't seen them, but it wouldn't surprise me if they're there, is quality of life scales that could be done through apps. Also apps for patients as reminders to go to their visits, reminders to take their medication, and reminders to fill out the forms that is going to be used for. What's the future? I think now with the technology that we have available to us, where wristwatches can give you your pulse and they could give you your heart rate, and they could tell you if you're having arrhythmia, I could see something happening into the future that even could become more interesting, not only like right now is touching on cardiology perhaps, but maybe in oncology as well, where these technologies could tell you exactly what's going on through very minimal invasive approaches for what's going on with your body. And I think we'll probably see that within the next few years, where it'll minimize the time that patients need to go see their doctors, and we can get a wealth of data relatively easily and relatively inexpensively, maybe through just a simple watch.
Yeah, well, it certainly is a hectic, crazy, ever fluid time, but obviously exciting time too, as we're moving forward with the evolution of clinical trials.
Yeah. Hey, great discussion, Nick and Steve. And just to continue on, just had a question, Nick, about reporting and announcing results of at various meetings and association meetings and other clinical meetings. Traditionally, large association meetings such as ASCO, which is happening now, and ICAC and AHA have been major launching points for clinical trial data and results. Do you see this changing in the future?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned ASCO, and it was interesting. I signed up for ASCO this year, and then I logged in to try to get into the meetings, and I couldn't get in. I think I tried like 3 times, and I had no success logging into seeing any of the sessions. And then I was reading some blogs the other day, and a lot of my colleagues couldn't get in either. So this virtual meeting, great idea, but I think there was a lot of hiccups, and we have a lot to learn from it. But is it the future that things are going to go more and more virtual? Maybe, but I do think it's going to be impossible to replace the human aspect of meeting with your colleagues and discussing the data. To be honest, a big reason why I go to ASCO, maybe half the reason why I go to ASCO, is to see my colleagues and to get together and to talk about what's going on. And then this sort of sets the tone for what to expect in the coming year when you have a little chat with your friends and talk about things. Meanwhile, the announcements, because there's so many announcements going on at a meeting like ASCO, they almost drown out each other. I think that's still going to happen, but maybe in a different format, maybe not as what we saw in the years past. But right now, my prediction is going into the future, ASCO is going to remain important, but will there be tens of thousands of people going? Probably not. Which might be a shame, but I think the world is changing for these big meetings.
Well, the social aspect of meetings is certainly, I know we all understand getting together with colleagues and sharing information and, participating in events and being able to ask questions and things like that. I mean, if these meetings do continue to be virtual or they become smaller live meetings at some point in time as we go down the road, what are the ways do you think you'll be able to communicate some of the results of your clinical studies and information and report results how do you think that would work above and beyond the virtual or live meetings?
Yeah, well, one thing that probably will not change is going through a review process, a peer review process. So hopefully that does not change. I mean, that's the basis of science. And then how you make those announcements, I guess, is going to be up to the authors. Do they want to submit their abstracts to a meeting like ASCO? Or do they want to just get it published quickly in a journal as soon as they can? I mean, now there's a number of journals that are totally virtual, and they turn around data, scientific data, very quickly. Will that have an impact on journals like the New England Journal, like JAMA, like JCO? Probably not. But I think right now they're feeling the competition from technology, where these virtual journals are able to turn things around quickly. They have very high quality data, and it's much more accessible to many more people.
Well, the technology and innovation is seems like it's almost changing daily, and it's certainly evolving quickly, especially when you get into a situation like we have now with this pandemic, where people are looking at different ways to do things, and almost reinventing the question. And just speaking of technology and how we're evolving, let's say you have a crystal ball, looking 5 years from now. Where do you see clinical research, and how do you see conducting clinical trials? How does it look? What do you think is going to happen, 5 years from now?
That's a tough question. Back in the day when I started in clinical research, we were just about getting through the HIV epidemic. And the impact HIV had on the research world was quite phenomenal. I mean, number one, what we got out of that in terms of just the impact on research was compassionate use, accelerated approvals, fast track. And so there was this entire movement between the industry, between regulatory authorities on how to get things faster to the patient. That was a big push, and it really changed the way things were being done. Will COVID have a similar impact on us? I would predict yes. We already see in the newspapers, for example, on vaccine development. Already we hear the leaders of a number of pharmaceutical companies talking about that they're cutting their times in fractions, where they're going to be able to get out a vaccine maybe at the end of this year. Some people are even claiming sooner, and already they're having early human results with vaccines, which was a year ago unbelievable. So what I think is going to happen for sure is that people are going to start looking at developing drugs, manufacturing drugs much more faster. They're going to start asking questions. Do we really need to take this step? Is there things we can do in parallel? Is there things that we can do faster? Because that's what this pandemic is demanding of us. So if there's any success out of this or any good thing that comes out of this, I think it's going to be a whole new look on how we develop drugs, how we manufacture drugs, and how we regulate them through that process. So what's it going to be in 5 years? I can promise you, I think it's going to be a lot different, and it's going to be a lot faster. How we do it is still to be seen.
Excellent, Nick. Thanks for all your great insights and all your great comments. We appreciate you participating today in this podcast. And I'm sure this information will be of tremendous value to many of your colleagues and others in the healthcare industry. For all those listening to this podcast, be sure to look for more installments in this podcast series in the coming weeks. This is Bob Karczewski for RX Health Watch, The Right Dose, saying be healthy, be smart.